you and I go way back, whether you know it or not. And so you have invited me, as you do in your newest book, Rethinking Life, you invited me into proximity to people who experience life in a different way than I do. And in a few different places, you say that proximity changes everything. I'd say that's one of the major themes of your book. So I know, that's been true for me. Proximity has changed me. One of the things that really resonates throughout your book, you ask often, is what does love require of us?
Mm.
And I wonder, do you see this as a sort of unifying question that sort of transcends some of our political and religious differences these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, books kind of find their way into they sort of write themselves as you start listening and, just putting pen to paper or whatever. And that was one of the things, like a chorus or a refrain of a song I kept coming back to, is what does love require of us?
Hmm.
And of course, begin by talking about how I was raised to think about sin just as kind of disobeying God and breaking God's commands, and God getting pretty mad about that. In contrast to how I think of sin now, which is um, falling short of love,
Hmm.
for others, for ourselves, for the earth, for the poor, and that God's really trying to protect people, including ourselves, protect us from ourselves, I guess you might say. So,
Yeah.
uh, but uh, and I think especially when it comes to some of these big issues that I wrestle with in the book, abortion, the death penalty, gun violence. I mean, the book's not just about hot button issues, but a better framework for thinking about those. But uh, the question underneath everything is, what does love look like, right?
Hmm.
What does love our neighbor look like when it comes to immigrants and refugees? What does love look like when it comes to the death penalty, even for someone who's done something really terrible?
Yeah.
That's I think that's the right question, and that's the question that kind of found me as I was writing the book.
Mm, I love it. Yeah. And in chapter 3, I think you flesh out this idea a little bit about the garden. So can we talk about the two trees for a second? Because I can't talk enough about the two trees in the garden. That the opposite of life isn't like the tree of death; it's the tree of judgment. Moral judgment, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And you write in chapter 15 also that self righteousness is always toxic, but humility is life giving. And it feels like in that beautiful poem that there's this invitation to life, which is humility, which is embrace of this life that the Creator has given us. And the antithesis of that is moral judgment. I wonder, if that sort of resonates with your experience of being within the midst of these hot button issues for as long as I can remember you speaking, that you see this difference between these two sort of paths, that life is often paved by humility and people being willing to have these conversations, or death is sort of the result of much of this, as you discuss, our thoughts about everyone being evil that doesn't agree with us.
Yeah, man, we can chew on it a little bit, and feel free to dive a little deeper. But yeah, I like so. I mean, my first thought is that in the book I talk about the word human comes from the same root as humility, and it has to do with the dirt. The fact that God
Yeah.
breathed life into dirt, um, and uh, that that combination, that we're made from the dirt, but we're also made in the image of God,
Hmm.
is something that I think is at the heart of the gospel and the human story, the Bible, is that we are both beloved and broken. We are beautiful and fallen, and sometimes, like, the church, I think, is really good at overemphasizing one of those.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's good to keep those in kind of a equilibrium, or
Yeah.
integration to so I know a lot of people that they know that they are beautiful, you know,
That's
um,
nice. That's
and they
nice.
need to be reminded that they're, that we're broken. And other folks that history and maybe even their current reality has kind of denied their beauty and their belovedness.
Hmm.
and the sacredness of their life.
Yeah.
I think particularly there's a lot of dynamics to this, but particularly race is one good way to think of that.
Yep.
So that's why it's so important to affirm what we have been very slow or negligent to affirm historically. And um,
For sure.
yeah, and so I think the opposite of humility is that self-righteousness,
Yeah.
is thinking too highly of ourselves and too lowly of others.
Mm.
And that can be partisan. It doesn't distinguish. I think there's lots of flavors of self-righteousness, but it's
Yeah.
always toxic. And
Mm.
Jesus describes this thing that he calls the yeast of the Pharisees. And I think it's this sort of um, uh, moral superiority. And I grew up with a conservative version of that. That
Yeah.
was, about legalism and obeying the rules and not listening to secular music and
Yep.
not smoking or drinking, or at least not getting caught when you do it. But I think there's a progressive form, of
Yeah.
that as well, which is still got an element of policing and theological litmus tests and um, its own version of cancel culture. So I think that's why it's so important to realize that these things like arrogance or self-righteousness, they're a part of the human condition, and
Yeah.
they're really destructive, because you can be moral but
Yeah.
not alive. You can keep whatever rules, whether it's not drinking Starbucks or using plastic and driving your Tesla or Prius or whatever, or uh, kind of doing all the right religious stuff. But if you're like moral righteousness um, is hurting other people, or is standing over other people, I think it begins to defeat the very purpose, which is why we keep coming back to this question of love, right? And
Yes.
I quote Barbara Brown Taylor, who I
Yeah.
love. My paraphrase of her would be that, if my theology gets in the way of loving my neighbor, I'm going to choose my neighbor because God never called me to love my theology. Or we
Right.
might even also say political ideology,
Absolutely.
whatever those things are. If our opinions and our beliefs get in the way of love, then we got to really question those convictions, even as heartfelt as they may be. And scripture gets at this, like there's a
Yep.
beautiful scripture that says we can have faith to move mountains, we can speak in the tongues of men and of angels, we can have, do all sorts of miracles and prophecies. And interestingly enough, it says we can even give everything we have to the poor.
Right.
But if we don't have love, it's still empty. So it,
Yeah.
it really is about love.
Absolutely. I wonder, you talk a little bit about at the beginning there about people who think too highly of themselves, but also those who don't. Growing up in a similar time period, evangelicalism in the 80s, there's a really heavy emphasis on feeling like, the God of the universe loves you deeply, right? So much so that if you were the only person on earth, they'd tell you that Jesus would die for you. But then at the same time, feeling like you're worthless, and that if you're to be your true self in some way, that God doesn't love you for some reason. And there's this constant going back and forth that I don't think a young mind can really grasp. And so we've seen with the generations that I'm a part of, just this mass exodus from the evangelical church. And do you think that that has to do with this lack of this ability to say what's right, but not to do what is loving, or to leave space for questions and for sort of what do you think about maybe might have driven that movement, and have you engaged much with people who have found themselves not able to stay within their tradition anymore?
Well, so if one of our real uh well, in our community, Dave, we get a lot of donations, and you don't want to just dive into the dairy until it passes the sniff test, right? And I
Yes.
kind of mentioned this in the
Yeah,
book
you
that
do.
uh in the same way, so if you don't smell it first, and it doesn't pass that, then you sure don't want to eat it. It's going to make you sick. And I think there's versions of Christianity that are like that, right?
Yeah.
That they really they don't pass the sniff test. They don't smell like Jesus. They
Mm,
don't act like Jesus. They don't love like Jesus. And that's why I think it's so important. Jesus said, they will know that you're mine by your love. That Christians, evangelical Christians in particular, I think have not been distinguished often by our love. We're known
Mm,
for a lot of other things, and there's a million studies that show that.
yeah.
I remember the Barna Research Group went to every state in the U.S. and they asked people, "What do you think of when you hear Christian?" And the answers they found were heartbreaking.
Yeah,
The
for sure.
number one was anti-gay,
Yeah.
anti-homosexual. Number two was judgmental and then hypocritical. And there's a recent article that Kate, I think at Christianity Today wrote that said evangelicals are uh, the most loved religious sect by evangelicals, and among every other faith demographic, we're like not well loved, and for good reason,
It is true.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why, and I mean,
Yeah.
Russell Moore wrote an interesting piece too. He said that, a generation ago, people were leaving the church because they didn't believe some of the core doctrines of Christianity.
Yeah.
But he said people are leaving now because they believe Christians don't believe some of those core doctrines.
Mm. Oh, that's so true.
It's really interesting because you look at, I mean, I think there's a lot of touch points here, but certainly the 80+% of white evangelicals that supported and defended Donald Trump,
Yeah,
I think that really surfaced some stuff where you go,
definitely.
yo, we got some major lights on the radar going on right now,
Yes.
and this is not just about partisan politics or something. This is about things that are indefensible
Yeah.
and in absolute contradiction to the things that Jesus lived and died for and rose from the dead for, right?
Yes.
Um
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, you think of like the Beatitudes and the
Mhm.
fruit of the Spirit, these things I
Yeah.
learned in vacation Bible school:
Right.
joy, peace, patience, kindness.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Donald Trump is like embodies sort of the antithesis of
Right.
all that.
Yep.
I mean, the man's made in the image of God. If Jesus's grace isn't big enough for Donald, it's not big enough for me. But I'm going to tell you, like, his life currently looks more like the seven deadly sins than those fruit of the Spirit, right? So I
Yeah,
think we
for
got to
sure.
name that, and I
Yeah,
think that's the kind of thing that a lot of people are dumbfounded by,
for
right?
sure. Yes.
Many Christian, kind of prominent Christian figures in white evangelicalism kind of forfeited their soul
Mm.
and their moral credibility in order to get a couple of seats on the Supreme Court, and support
Yes.
Donald Trump. And it's as if we never read the words of Jesus. It said, "What good is it to gain the whole world, not even the Supreme Court, but the whole world, and lose your soul?" Right?
Yes. Right.
That losing of the soul, I think, is there. Yeah, and
Well,
anyway, I might be talking too much, but
no,
the
you're
one thing I
preaching.
want
You're
to say,
preaching.
Dave, is that what I hope we'll talk about too is that the spiritual landscape of Christianity is so much bigger
Yes.
than the people with the biggest bullhorn and the people who have genuinely kind of monopolized the narrative,
Well,
in the headlines.
yes, I would like to talk about that because you talk often in your book about James Cone, and as you and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were major catalysts towards my understanding of Jesus in a different light than the one I was brought up with. James Cone is why I'm still a person of faith today. His book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, taught me about a Jesus that I just never would have dreamed of as a white evangelical growing up in America. And I think his that solidarity with those in despair, I think, is what, when he wrote in The God of the Oppressed, he also writes a lot about this. It makes me think about how you also describe yourself as an eternal optimist
Mm.
in the book, and that's my experience of you. But I wonder, in connection to that, those faith traditions that don't try to or ignore what the realities of life are that you touch so much on in the book, as someone who's an eternal optimist, are there times when you feel despair, like the work that you're doing isn't going to make a difference?
I think it's important to start by saying, um, not everybody that's been close to God has felt really joy all the time. Not
Yeah.
all those who have been near to the um, the brokenness of this world have felt that joy all the time. In some ways, there's sort of a discipline to joy, and I think there's ways that we can protect our joy, that we can surround ourselves with folks who have a defiant,
Mm.
resilient joy and hope despite the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Uh, but having said that, I think of Rich Mullins, great singer and songwriter who I got to know a little bit, and
Mm.
he suffered deeply sometimes with that long loneliness. Dorothy Day wrote a book entitled that. She's another
Yeah.
great inspiration of mine, The Long Loneliness. Mother Teresa talks about the darkness of despair that she was in at times. I mean, for not for like a few days, but
Right.
for years and
Well,
decades.
when you spent time with her, was she experiencing any of that? Did she share any of that, or was that at different time periods?
Well, it wasn't like we were like having this little
Buddies.
like but Mother Teresa, like just hanging out, but I mean, it doesn't surprise me,
Yeah.
but again, that discipline everywhere you go in those homes with so much pain.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
there's reminders of to smile and the power of joy, and
Mm.
you know, and that we're not just doing the work, but it's how much love you put into every act. So there's constant reminders of that, and maybe it's because Mother Teresa herself needed those reminders,
Yeah,
uh, but
absolutely.
but I even look at Jesus, who is as close to God as it gets, is God, and yet cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Mm.
And man, if you can't ponder that for the rest of your life,
Right.
like that God felt the absence of God.
Mm.
Uh, so I think that that's a not only okay place, but it's a perfectly um, natural and human, and it's almost like if we don't feel some sense of despair, are we really close enough to the pain of the world? And yet also I think Jesus laughed like crazy. I think that there's also a sense that um, that one of my mentors said, um, if you can't laugh, then the devil's already won.
Mm.
So that we
Yeah.
kind of
Yes.
keep that. So yeah, but I think that those are the sort of a combination, and again, I think part of how I keep that alive is I mean, in a lot of among a lot of the people who you would think have every reason not to hope, there's that really powerful sense of joy and hope. And I was reflecting on that this month, with the anniversary of the bombing and the war in Iraq. And we
Yeah.
were, 20 years ago, we were in Baghdad as 900 bombs a day were falling. So there were days we didn't know if we would live. There were days that I was so heartbroken that this isn't just some radical extremist group. Like, this is the US government,
Right.
with the backing and blessing of many Christians and pastors that were dropping these bombs on Iraq.
Yes.
And yet in the middle of that, we're throwing birthday parties, we're turning backflips,
Mm.
I mean, the kids are just cracking us up
Mm.
till we wheeze. So I mean, I think that's a part of where we find ourselves in this world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I saw a recent video where there was someone saying, George Bush isn't this sweet man that everyone says he is, and they cite the things that he did. And I think you talk about this in the book about how it's both things. The people that are close to him might see him as a sweet man. He's not this, bomb dropping person that many people do see him as. There are human elements to these people, and it's hard depending on the vantage point that you look at someone from.
Well,
You're
I think this is one of the places where Martin Luther was right. I'm pretty
mm,
hard on him in my new book,
you are, yeah. Thankfully, thankfully,
for
yeah,
right reason,
yeah,
but
yeah.
good reason. But he said essentially there's a sinner and a saint at war within each one of us.
Mm,
And every day, every moment, we get to choose who we're going to be. Um, and I think that's true. For every human being, we've got this sort of um, this beauty and brokenness, this uh, um, uh, monster and this saint that, kind of are at war within our own soul. And please, this is not just true of, George Bush and Donald Trump, but I think
Oh
it's
yeah.
true of every one of us, and to be fair with the violence, um, in 2016, this bombing continued, right? Now, Iraq
Yes.
and Afghanistan,
Yes.
and the US dropped 26,000 bombs
Yep.
in 2016, 72 a day, 3 an hour, and
Mm.
Obama was president.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
Obama bombed a hospital,
Yeah.
in Kunduz. So this is part of, I think, I'm not making an equivalency. I'm
No,
just
no,
saying that this
no. That's the thing, and
is
that's
part of
why.
what it looks like to be commander in chief of the biggest empire of the world with the biggest bombs in the world,
Yes.
and we're the only country that has dropped nuclear bombs. And so there's that kind of is it. So this paradox
Mm.
of the American dream and, the and even the beautiful things of America,
Yeah.
um, there's a paradox. There's this
Yes.
mythology of America. There's this denial of the terrible sins of our past and our
Yep.
present.
Yep.
And that's true in the church. And I try to be really honest about that too. You've kind of got these competing narratives,
Yes.
and one is deadly, and one is championing life. And a
Mm.
lot of times, though, that same angel and demon, are at war in the church. And periods like Hitler and the colonization, Columbus,
Yeah.
like these are literally competing Christianities that are
Yeah.
at work.
Absolutely. I know that from previous writings, you wrote Jesus for President, which has this Anabaptist sort of thing going on, that really captivated me, which is like our allegiance is not to whatever country we're in, especially not to the empire that most resembles Rome, but to the kingdom of God, right? And so I know even within, with every tradition that we talk about, there's always that this is beautiful, and then there's this part, because if there are humans, there are those both and situations. But I wonder for you, if you're to sort of think about all these theological or tradition sort of influences, like you say, you're a spiritual mutt in the book, I think. Which of these traditions that you mentioned are sort of, do they ebb and flow that you lean into? Can you sort of pinpoint, well, this is where that idea comes from? Because you do speak a lot like what I would say resonates like an Anabaptist. But there's also Drew Hart, who's an Anablactivist, I think he describes himself as. Um,
Yeah, he's a good buddy of mine. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I would imagine he's in Pennsylvania, right? Or was. But there's all these traditions that have so much beauty in them that you can pull from. Is that one of those traditions that you find to have a lot of resonance with?
So absolutely, and I mean, some of this is having um, been kind of leaning into different parts of streams of Christianity. I grew up Methodist, and some of that I circle back to. Years later, I come
Yeah,
back and have a fuller appreciation of John Wesley and
yeah,
the radical nature of so much of his teaching. I mean, he capped his income off and lived off nearly nothing, and said, if I die with more than 10 pounds, let everybody call me a liar and a
yeah,
thief,
yep.
So there's this radical justice ethic. I mean, even to this day, the Methodists have one of the best statements on the death penalty,
Wow.
saying that it's a betrayal of the power of Jesus to
Hmm.
redeem and restore and transform every person. So,
Wow.
I mean, it's a powerful statement, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
um, and the Methodists are missing on some other things.
Yeah.
They're splitting over sexuality. I can't hold attention on that. They're also like, I don't know. There's some bones to spit out.
Yeah.
So then I went into the charismatic Pentecostal world, and that shaped me. And I still am shaped by that. I believe in miracles. I
Mm.
believe in kind of the supernatural and the interaction of God with this world. And I mean, I've seen it. I don't just believe it.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
experienced it.
Yeah.
So I believe in that. But man, some of that stuff gets really exploited and
Yeah.
whacked out, and we
Yeah.
got people that are like using revival language to try to champion Christian nationalism and all kinds of stuff. So there's
Yeah.
always bones to spit out. Then,
Yeah.
I leaned into the Catholic Church, and there's so much that I love. The idea of, the sacraments, the holiness of God in like concrete things in real life, and uh, a lot of how I've learned to pray was from Catholics, folks like Mother Teresa and other mentors of mine, that,
Mm.
um, and then there's still some things there that I'm like, yeah, I'm not quite, ready to be Catholic. But,
I like
again,
that, spitting the bones out. I like that. I like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
I think it was Stanley Hauerwas, who's very,
Yeah.
Anabaptist and
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
great friend, and,
Mm.
someone that's, really sharpened my own thinking. But he said, I think he said something like, everybody should disagree with at least one or two tenets of
Mm.
their own faith tradition, but
Yes.
you don't want to disagree with three or four or more. So you got to find one that has a good balance in it, So anyway,
That's
but
tough.
but the Anabaptists certainly,
Yeah.
the idea that we're in the world but not of it, that we're to
Yeah.
be a contrast society, that we're to moderate
Yeah.
the hope that we have in politicians and government, and these systems are never going to fully enact, God's dream for the world. Like the church is a primary instrument that God's using to transform the world. So that theology, that gave birth to Jesus for president, and so you still see it in so much of my writing, is there. um, and there's vulnerabilities,
Yeah.
some
Yes.
Anabaptists can tend to be very not politically engaged, not in the streets on marches, might have missed out on what Dr. King and some others were doing because that was a little too worldly, and
Yeah.
so not all Anabaptists, but I'm just saying those are some of the vulnerabilities there, so
Absolutely.
it's a delicate dance there,
It
so
is.
yeah.
Yeah. No, that's
But this is where, when you get outside of white Christianity, you get some of this really robust stuff that integrates a lot of that, right?
yes.
Like the historic
Absolutely.
Black church moderates its expectations of systems that have oppressed them for hundreds of years. And yet they continue to champion voters' rights and things like that, because this is a part of what it means to affirm someone's humanity and the image of God in them, is not to just, to discriminate. And yet, no law can make you love somebody. I love how
Right.
Dr. King said it, like, no law can make you love me, but
Mm.
it can make it harder for you to kill me.
Yes. That's
So
so
that's a
true.
good lesson of history,
Yeah.
is it so.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
the liberation
Yeah.
theology of Latin America, some of those more robust theologies, James Cone, Howard
Yeah.
Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited, those things have emerged out of that. So there's a healthy suspicion where there needs to be suspicion of power
Mm.
that goes all the way back to 33 AD and even before that,
Absolutely.
but
Well,
there's,
that
yeah, so
suspicion,
anyway, yeah.
no, that's so good because that suspicion of power is a lot more natural to people who don't benefit from power, right? But we benefited from it. You and I benefited from that power and that privilege. So it's hard. It's a longer road, and we have to observe those other traditions. I visited John Perkins, well, Big John, who we
Yeah.
recently lost. And I remember there was a story you told. I think it was John Perkins came to your community in Philadelphia, and I think you were struggling with, well, I haven't seen the change that I expected. Right? Is this
Yeah.
something that you share?
Yeah.
Now you've been there about 20 years, right?
25. Do you believe that? A
25.
quarter of a century. Yeah, I was
All
telling the
right.
young people the other
In-
day, we started this thing back in the 1900s.
when you had dreadlocks, right? And
Yep.
I instantly feel old hearing that. Thank you.
Mhm.
But
Imagine
I,
how I feel.
I bet, yeah. So like, you
So
inspired.
we were on the steps and Dr. Perkins was
That's it.
hanging out.
That's it.
We're
That's it.
he was actually came, and we've been working all day. We're gonna give him a tour. We're gonna impress Dr. Perkins. We're gonna take him in some abandoned houses we're fixing up. And he comes here and just starts playing with the kids and eating ice cream and cutting up, and didn't need to be impressed by anything. Um and and that's when I said, we're a little disheartened, we're kind of discouraged,
Yeah, yeah.
and he said, how long have you been here? And I was like, oh, we've been here like I think it's been like 5 or
5 years.
6 years, and he's like, you're going to start to see things change in about 10 years, maybe 15. And
Yeah.
that was his word of encouragement. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, 25 years. I mean, in fact, there's days that it doesn't feel like we're gaining anything,
Yeah.
I mean, um, but this is where Gandhi helps me too, where
Mm.
like you do what's right regardless of the results. Like, in fact, this is a long arc that bends towards justice, and
Yeah.
some of this people like Dr. King and others, and Gandhi was killed too. They're
Yep.
fighting for things that they might not even ever live to see,
Right.
but they knew that it was right, and they're fighting for something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a hard truth to hold. um and it's one of those things that idea of, I guess I wonder, as someone who's an eternal optimist, you sort of keep both that perspective and that fully staying present in where you are, I would imagine sometimes is a challenge. Especially when you describe, I think recently you posted something about a tragedy that happened in your neighborhood, like on your doorstep, essentially. In those moments, you're staying fully present, and it must feel like, well, how has anything changed here? Is my impact? Is there any difference? Um, but believing with your whole heart that this way of love, this way of life, is true and is the thing that lasts, must, I imagine, keep you going.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be specific about hope, right? You're not
Yeah.
just hoping in anything.
Right. Yeah. Let's
Um,
hear that.
and I think that's one of the things that I've learned anyway in whatever the quarter of a century here has taught me um, I mean, there's that old hymn that says, "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. All other ground is sinking sand." And there's a whole lot of sinking sand. And I think there's times
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
we've put our hope in political parties or candidates but this is where it gets tricky, right? Because I have an expectation that I think
Yes.
is reasonable. And
Yeah.
in this particular case, when someone lost their life this week in our neighborhood, my hope was that the police would be a little bit more compassionate
Mm,
how they
yes.
were interacting in our neighborhood. And one of them essentially said, "This is Kensington. What do you expect?" Like this, he said, "This is reality."
Yep.
And that's where and this is as a body's laying in this, it was actually in a shopping cart, right? And we're trying to cover that up so that the kids don't see it. This is 7:30 in the morning. They're going to
Mm,
school. We're like, all that we're asking, like, and you imagine this happening anywhere else in the suburbs of Philly. Like
yep.
they're
Yep.
gonna
No
have
way.
like an entire crime scene tent up or something, like they're not
Yep.
gonna let these little beautiful 8-year-old kids see a body on the street, right? So I mean, it was maddening. So but I'm also trying to go like I hear Jesus, I hear Dr. King, I hear others going, there's humanity in that police officer, right?
Mm,
So don't squash him with my own. So I'm going, and I told him, I said, that's somebody's baby. I mean,
mm,
that's a human being
mm.
made in the image of God in that shopping cart. We can't get used to that, and our children should never have to see that, um, as if that were just something that happens,
Yes.
right? That this is reality. And so the fact that this officer, you start asking deeper questions. What got him to the place
Yeah.
where his heart's that hard,
Mm,
right? He's seen so much that it has um, created that callousness,
yeah.
and I'm capable of that too. So I don't,
Absolutely.
I think that's where you go. We got to realize that this is affecting other folks, and I got my views on policing, but I'm
Yeah.
saying this brother's right there. Like I want more for him. Like I don't want this to be normal for him to see a body and be like, oh man, what a this stinks. I got to sit here. He sat here for like 3 hours looking at that body. So that's
Yes.
not good. That's not
No,
good.
it's not. It's obviously not
Yeah.
good for him. The fact that he says, well, this is reality, that's the internalized message he has, right?
Yeah. So
So,
anyway, that's a
yeah.
lot. And I'm sorry people listen have to hear that, but I'm also sorry that we have to see it, that our kids have to reckon with that, right? And
No,
and
I,
that's why I wrote this book, is to
yes.
say we've got to continually insist that that there's a sacredness to life, that every person is made in the image of God. And that means this person who is in a shopping cart, and that's like, but it also means this police officer who has having seemingly a hard time even recognizing the sacredness of this person's life. It means like, so it's always a stretch, right? To say that like love has no boundaries, and I want to do, I want to love in a way that brings life to every side of this,
Mm,
that's what we want to live after. And we got to
mm.
keep anchoring ourselves in that, or else our well will run dry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that does happen, right? This is one of the things that is often the case. You work in the if you work in the realm of human services, even within faith traditions or religious organizations, there's talk of burnout, there's talk of boundaries, and you're someone who said, you just said love is something that doesn't have boundaries. You've thrown yourself into circumstances, into wars, into places like this. Have you experienced extended periods of burnout or of depression? Is this something that you can resonate with, that other people have experienced because you've been at it for a long time, and you've been in the thick of it? Is this something that you can resonate with or that you've experienced on your own?
I certainly have times where I experience deep grief and disappointment, like
Yeah.
with political folks especially, and pastors, fellow Christians, bishops, that I expect more of. I mean, even President Biden, there's some things that he's done I think that are wonderful. We've been trying to get a few little things done.
Yeah. Small
like
thing. Yeah.
like tear down the execution chamber that the
Yeah.
federal government uses to kill people. Like,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
seems like an easy ask,
It does.
and everybody that we talk to, even at the White House, seems to think it's an easy ask. So, like, why can't we get some things done? So there's that disappointment. But I like, again, if I was like a card holding Democrat that like, here we are, we're gonna do this thing, like I would be devastated. But
Yeah.
I've moderated that hope, right?
Mm.
Like, and that's not to say that I'm any less passionate. Um, about tearing down the death chamber, or getting, assault weapons off the streets, or, welcoming asylum seekers. Lord have mercy. I mean,
Mm.
we're seeing the same policies that Trump had at the border. Like, so I think that's where I get my energy
Yeah.
is from being near to the people who are, in my neighborhood, by having my feet on the ground. I'll say this, Dave, like there's kind of a micro and a macro side to change,
Yeah.
and I've got friends that are working in DC on policy changes at a macro level, and they're not seeing change, and they're getting tired.
Yeah.
Um, well, one of the things they need is to have a snowball fight. They need to come. They need to juggle with the kids on our block. They need to, hang out in the neighborhood, help a kid with their math homework, right? Like, that's what they need. There's other people that they're sitting here day after day giving out food. We've got hundreds of people getting bags of food. We're lifting people off of our streets that are overdosed from heroin. Like, we're getting tired if all we're doing is immediate relief and response to crises. Um,
Yes.
and so that's why some of the folks doing the everyday work of charity and compassion need to also be in the streets advocating for systemic changes,
Mm.
asking why people are hungry, even as we are giving out the food bags, right? So I think those things
Yes.
have to go together. I get tired if I don't have that dance figured out between the micro and macro. I got to have both of those in my own life. And
Yeah.
and the last thing I'll say is, we're transforming these guns into garden tools,
Yeah.
like literally taking guns off the street, turn them into garden tools. And you take this, like, kind of, we always say there's a lot of sermons in the forge and in the fire, because you take this kind of dull, hard, dark metal, and you put it in the fire, and it begins to glow, and it
Mm.
begins to warm and soften. And there comes a point where you can't even distinguish the metal from the fire. It's like literally taking it on. We sometimes say this is a whole sermon in here, because if you take the metal out, it begins to cool. And so you got to keep returning to the fire. And for me, that's what faith is about. It's about staying near to Jesus. It's coming back, praying that God would fill us up with God's love and compassion when we are starting to run dry, like warm up, soften our heart again. We sometimes say Pharaoh, his heart hardened because he stayed away from the fire too long. So I think that You know, that analogy, I think, is a metaphor, at least for me in my own prayer life. And I look at Mother Teresa, you know, even when she didn't feel it, every day she's praying. I know because I prayed with her. She
Mm,
prays every morning. She prayed, may every person I come in contact with feel your presence in my soul.
mm,
May I leave off your fragrance everywhere I go. And she was praying that Jesus would live in her, that literally she'd be able to say with Paul, you know, the life I live, I no longer live, but Jesus lives in me, that she would carry the fire, you know, into the world. So that's what we keep running back to. You know, it's what prayer is. I think that's what the spiritual disciplines do for us. They kind of are holy habits and exercises for our soul. Just as we exercise our body, we've got to kind of keep our soul and their spiritual life healthy. So
mm.
I don't have all the answers to that, but I know that you know, that's what I'm aspiring to do in my own life.
Well, and you ask a lot of good questions too, and I think that's one of the things that I've learned most from my relationship with rabbis is the next great, response to a question you have is another great question.
Yeah.
you know, I wonder, if in your pursuit of this hope that you have, because it is an active pursuit, and Jesus does say in the Sermon on the Mount that if you listen and do these things, then you're on solid ground. It's that sinking sand thing that we find very often within the traditions that have disenfranchised us. But when you do interfaith work, when you work with people who are on the same path, pursuing the same thing, that must be really life-giving and joyful.
Yeah, I think so. You know, and I was still thinking about what you were saying about the questions, because we got to keep asking questions. We got to stay curious. We got to have that kind of, you know, Jesus called the childlike faith. You know,
Yes.
that the kids are always learning and they're always asking questions. Some of them to the point of being annoying. You know, but you're asking these questions, and I think I think it was my brother, my friend Jamar Tisby, who said someone they were talking about Christianity. He and a friend or something, and he said the person said to him, "Christians are people who have all of the answers all of the time."
Mm.
And he was not saying that in a positive thing. He was
No.
saying like they, you know, they don't have any questions. They don't have any curiosity.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous place to be. That's why Jesus was always asking questions. He was
Yes.
questioning. He wasn't answering the questions. He was questioning the answers. Right. He, like
Yeah.
everybody that thought they had it figured out, he would put a hole in that theology. You know, and so that's what, you know, the Jewish communities taught me that too. My rabbinical friends taught me. You know, you got to. This is all about asking questions. It's all about curiosity. I mean, we're trying to put words to the indescribable God. Like so, we're all, the best that we're doing is just pondering and learning about God. Like the minute this is a puzzle that we try to figure out, and that's what happens to a lot of Christians. I
Yeah.
think with, you know, we end up with this theology that is why I have such a problem with. I'm not busting on people, but the Calvinism and stuff,
Yeah.
you know, is
Yep.
there's such a certainty about
Yes.
all these doctrines that is like, what are you describing? You know, like this is God. This is God. You know, and so you end up with it, and the problem is you end up with these theological constructs
Yeah.
that don't hold up.
They
You know,
don't.
like
Right.
you end up if you got this idea of predestination that God didn't, you know, preordained everything, and then you get a 10-year-old girl that gets raped, and you're like your only answer is God had that happen for a reason.
Yep.
Nah, that's not it. You
It's
know,
not gonna work.
like I think that's where you go. No, I mean you can hold some tensions with this and go,
Yes.
you know, I don't know. I know that God is with that 10-year-old girl, and God feels that pain. Um,
But you have too much to lose when you're making that theology from an ivory tower.
yeah, right, right. And you know, and some of this is about Jesus too. It's going, you can end up with a theology that is maybe it looks good on paper. I don't know, but it's like God. There's a version of why Jesus died that I talk about in Rethinking Life, right?
Yeah.
That is God's got a gun pointed at humanity
Yes.
because we're so terrible and sinful. God, we deserve death, but God takes the gun off of us and points it at Jesus and kills Jesus in order to save us. And you're like, if that's your theology, like that creates a God that might be easy to fear, but
Yeah.
that's really hard to love, right? And
Yep.
so there's a better but I think this is where I would say, Dave, that the answer to bad theology is not no theology,
Mm.
but it's good theology, you know? So just because those theological constructs don't work, um, doesn't mean there is no God. It means that God maybe, perhaps it means that God's bigger than the boxes that we created for God, right?
Yeah.
That God can't fit into our heads or, um, and
I would imagine that's the case.
yeah, and I think that's why the mystics, that's why this
Yeah.
sort of fascination, and that's why love's so important.
Yeah.
It's like shooting your kid, like that don't sound like any version of love that I know, and so there must be more. So
Yeah.
maybe as James Cone, as Brian Zahn, as the womanist theologians, as so many teach us, like it's not that God needed Jesus to die.
Mm.
It's that God was willing to die.
Mm.
God was willing to come, leave all the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here on earth in the flesh, born with brown skin as a refugee in the middle of Herod's genocide, executed, condemned, uh, and to death on the cross with someone getting killed on his left and on his right. Like Jesus enters the suffering, even to that point of saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the God that I know and love. And that's the God that is, as scripture says, is fully revealed
Mm.
in Jesus. Like that's the full revelation of God. And yeah, man. and I started preaching on a podcast. Sorry, dude. Yeah.